Hi, Mary. Hi, Laura Lynn. Hi, One Eye. Hi, Donna Beatty. Guys, ready for a little bit longer short story before bed? A spooky one. Scary looking. Okay. I hope you guys can't hear the TV. Is it too loud? I'm really sorry if it is. Okay. I might get it. Hi, Kathleen Cruz. Okay, here we go, guys. Hi, Tabitha. Kathy, I'm still awake. Okay. And this story is called Eau de Eric. Like eau de perfume. Eau de Eric. Thank you, Kathleen. The writer of this one, she came up with this short story after she gave up smoking and found that she could smell properly again. Okay. And a little bit of history on her is that at the time she was working on a radio item about why smell is the most powerful of all 5 senses in conjuring memories and emotions. And she lives in London with her 2 children and their large collection of soft toys, and has excellent relations with all of them. Okay. Eau de Eric. And hi, anyone listening in a replay. Hello. Thank you for coming to listen. It was just another teddy picked up for 99p pennies, I guess, at a local charity shop until Ellie decided to name him Eric after her dead father. She named all her soft toys, but told her mother this one was special because it was big and hairy like Daddy had been. But Daddy didn't have black eyes, sweetie, Kathy said as she tucked Ellie into bed. His eyes were blue. Pence. I knew pennies wasn't right. It's pence. This writer's from Ireland, by the way. His eyes were blue. Ellie rubbed Eric's stitched nose against her own as she snuggled under the duvet. I know, but he smells like Daddy, she said. Kathy hadn't been able to resist a quick sniff herself, even though she didn't have particularly fond memories of her late husband. Ellie was right. There was something about the smell. A whiff of Eric's old aftershave buried deep into Teddy's matted fur. Kathy recognized the brand. It was one she'd managed to avoid ever since Eric had died, except for that one time when a shop attendant had sprayed it at her in a department store, part of some aggressive sales pitch. Kathy had recoiled, but it had been too late. The smell had clung to her hair and clothes for the rest of the day, as if the ghost of Eric, the real Eric, was intent on sticking around. How about Mummy puts Eric through the wash, Kathy said. Ellie shook her head, squeezing the teddy to her face. Kathy tugged and cajoled, but Ellie started crying, her eyes squeezed shut as she tucked her chin into her neck, hushed tears coursing over her flushed cheeks. That was often the way with Ellie. Her anger was silent. Tantrums were not her style. Kathy found it unnerving. More so since her father, Eric's death. Okay, Kathy said, getting up from beside the bed, if it means that much to you. But it unsettled her enough to mention it to Chris on the phone later that evening. You think she's figured it out about us? He said. I don't know, Kathy sighed. We've been so careful. It had been over a year since the funeral, and Kathy's therapist had said there was no need to keep her relationship with Chris under wraps. But Ellie was so sensitive, and Kathy had only been seeing Chris for a few months. It didn't feel right for him to stay overnight, not yet at least. A year wasn't long in the grand scheme of things, Kathy thought, given the traumatic circumstances of Eric's death. Because despite his faults, he'd been tender with Ellie in a way he'd never been with her. Ellie had been so little after all, too little to answer back. You're a good mother, Chris said. Am I? I'm not sure. I want to move on, but I don't know how to take her with me. You always put her first. That makes you a good mother. I'm sorry, she said. Sorry for you. Sorry I'm forcing this on you, too. There was a pause at the other end of the line. It's fine, Chris said. It's fine. She pictured him leaning forward, the phone at his ear, dragging his hand through his hair. She could love this man, she thought. Yes, she could. But she still felt uneasy as she climbed the stairs to bed that night. Turning at the top step, she caught sight of Eric through the open bedroom door, propped up against the wall next to her daughter's sleeping head. She went in, listening to Ellie's damp breathing, and for a moment, she felt observed, as if Eric's black button eyes were following her every move. She rubbed her hand over her face, feeling suddenly tired and heavy. It was Friday, and it had been a long week, too long. On Saturday, Ellie perched Eric on the table during breakfast, but Kathy drew the line at Ellie taking him along to her play date. Just let me get a little sip, guys. When it was time to go, Ellie stood stock still, hands rigid at her side, as Kathy buttoned up her coat. Mummy, I feel funny saying mummy, but that's how it is. Mummy, she said, and Kathy felt herself tense up. It was a voice her daughter only ever used when she was about to blindside her. Yes, sweetie? Promise me. Promise you what, sugar? Promise me you won't put Eric in the wash while I'm away. Kathy kept her eyes lowered, focusing on the top button. Course not, Kathy said, her fingers slipping over its smooth edges. Pinky promise, Mummy? Ellie smiled as they hooked their small fingers, and Kathy had really meant. Ellie smiled as they hooked their small fingers, and Kathy had really meant it then. She had other plans for the afternoon anyway. She was thinking of those plans, of Chris coming over as she struggled to stretch the vacuum cleaner's nozzle into the far corners of Ellie's room. There was always some fluff you couldn't quite catch. She reached down under the bed, pulling out a forgotten pajama top and stray pieces of Lego. And there was something else, something stuffed away to the far side. Gerald the giraffe, her gift to Ellie after the funeral. He must have fallen out of favor. She pulled him out by his long neck and positioned the nozzle to suck the gray dust off his body, watching the yellow and brown spots recover their color. Where to put Gerald? A collection of glazed plastic eyes looked back at her from the top of Ellie's bed, where the soft toys were gathered, as if in an amiable conference. Ellie had brought Eric back up to her room before going out and had given him pride of place, separate from the rest. He was laid out on her pillow, his face turned up to the ceiling. How about some company, Eric? She said, placing Gerald's thick snout next to Eric's head. Gerald, meet Eric. Eric, meet Gerald. Christ, she sounded like Ellie. Fantasy play, the therapist called it. It helped process difficult emotions, apparently. She dropped the nozzle and picked up Eric by the scruff of his neck, holding him to the front of her, next to Gerald. Nice to meet you, Eric, she said in a gruff voice. Gerald's neck drooped to one side. Now look what you've done. She turned Eric's face toward her own and scowled. I'm not going to say the word, but bastard, she said between tight lips. She paused, looking at Eric's scrunched up face and lifeless eyes. He really was quite ugly, his pug-like snout giving him a permanently disgruntled expression. She brought him close to her nose, daring herself to smell, and made a face. Here, take that, Stinky, she said, using one of Gerald's front legs to hit Eric in his middle. Good grief, what was she doing? She threw both stuffed toys on the bed and moved backward towards the door, dragging the vacuum cleaner with her. The other soft toys crowded the bed with their benign, shaggy aura, but Eric was practically pouting. She squared her shoulders and put her hands on her hips. You know what, Eric, she said, you're going in the wash. The washing machine whirred in the kitchen downstairs as Chris and Kathy lay in bed. The curtains were closed and only a pale afternoon light filtered through the gaps at the side. Kathy nestled into the curve of Chris's side and ran a finger over his profile. He smiled and kissed her forehead, and then rattling, shook the floorboards beneath them. "What's that noise?" he said, sniffing a strand of her hair. "Just the washing machine. Looks like someone's wrestling. Sounds like someone's wrestling with it. It's old. I should replace it. I just haven't gotten around to it yet." She brushed her lips over Chris's cheek near his ear. "It's on the to-do list." "The to-do list," he chuckled. "Yeah, what's wrong with that?" Nothing at all. You're so organized." And he squeezed her blank. I'm not going to say what that is. "You don't like that?" Kathy said, inclining her head. His finger ran down her navel. That's all we'll say there. Getting a little risque here. He says, "I love it." "Oh, no," Kathy said, as she sat up and pushed his hand away. "What?" "I've got to dry the teddy before Ellie gets back." She threw her legs over the side of the bed and reached for the shirt Chris had discarded in a hurry earlier. "The dryer," she said, glancing back at him, still splayed on the bed. "I forgot to program it." In the kitchen, the machine was ticking down the last of its cycle. Eric's face was distorted and angry through the damp of its glass. Ew. I'd be getting rid of this Eric bear. The black paint on his button eyes had chipped, and for a moment she thought he might be blinking at her. No, it had to be a trick of the light. She turned the dials and the machine churned as it started up again, as if gathering strength. She peered through the glass into the drum. Eric stared back at her. "What?" she said. "Got a problem?" She knocked on the glass, scowling, unaware that a naked Chris had padded in behind her on his bare feet. "Who are you talking to?" he said, circling his arms around her waist from behind. Him, she said, pointing at the drum where Eric was being thrown round and round. "You need to get out more," Chris said, laughing and kissing the back of her neck. She shrugged, smoothing down the hair on his arm. He turned her round to face him, pushed her up against the kitchen counter and gave her a long, wet kiss. I'm going to skip that little paragraph, that little sentence. She gripped the counter, glancing up at the kitchen clock. "There's no time," she said, pushing him gently back. Chris leaned his head on her shoulder, breathing out a weary sigh. "There's never enough time," he said. Ellie was not happy at all. "But you promised, Mommy." Her face was round and wet. "I know, sweetie, but he was really stinky." Kathy closed her eyes and shivered, remembering the smell. It still cloyed at her nostrils. "He didn't need a wash," Ellie pouted and wrapped her small, pudgy fingers round Eric's damp body. She sank her nose into his fur, and her frown disappeared. "Oh, I can still smell him." Kathy yanked Eric from her daughter's face, sticking him under her own nose. Damn it, her daughter was right. Oh, to Eric was still in there, musky and burned. But there was something else, too. "Give him back," Ellie said, stamping her foot. Her little arms were raised up in the air, straining to reach him. Kathy batted her away, sniffing again. There it was. A hot summer evening, a barbecue, the smoke from sizzling fat billowing upwards into a deepening blue sky. His fingers were wrapped around the neck of a beer bottle, and he'd flicked something at her, a piece of meat or charred vegetable. She couldn't remember exactly what. And then he'd pressed the scour, and then he'd pressed the scalding skewer on her arm. Yes, she could still feel it. Ellie had been in her arms, crying and sucking her shoulder because she'd missed a feed. She'd almost dropped her as she flinched in pain. He needs to go back in, Kathy said. No, Mummy, no. Ellie's bottom lip quivered and her hands clenched into fists. Kathy marched back into the kitchen, shaking off her daughter, who was tugging at her clothes. Get off, she shouted. It came out a little too sharp, more so than she'd intended. Mummy, no! Ellie stumbled as she followed her, but Kathy could still feel the slabs of stone chafing at her knees as she fell onto the ground that day, the shock of the glowing skewer's sting against her bare skin. She had cradled Ellie's head, protecting her from the fall. Please, Mummy, don't. Ellie's voice was choked and barely more than a whisper. Then the washing machine's door wouldn't close. Eric's arm kept flopping out and getting in the way. It hung limp, his head half out and turned upwards. Ellie reached to drag him out, but Kathy shoved her aside with her body, forgetting that she was bigger, an adult tussling with a mere child. Watch your hands, she said. There was a rip, like the sound of paper tearing. Stuffing spilled out of the seam between Eric's shoulder and arm. Mommy, you're hurting him. Ellie's face shone with tears and shock as she crept closer. He's a toy, Ellie, a toy, Kathy shouted as she chucked the teddy back into the drum, ripped shoulder and all. She pushed Ellie aside, sending her careening backward over the cold stone kitchen floor. Her foot shot out as she kicked the door shut and hurriedly twisted the dials. The machine started up, and Kathy wiped an arm over her face. Her hands were trembling. Ellie got up from the floor. She paused, her eyes lowered, and when she looked up, she'd rearranged her features into an impassive mask. There was nothing there, no flush, no tears. She smoothed her hands down her dress, her favorite lilac pinafore dress, the one with ebony edging, and watched in silence as Eric's paws clawed at the glass beneath the rising water. Tick, 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 they went. Ellie turned her gaze from the drum to her mother. I hate you, she said, and fled up the stairs to her room. Chris became elusive. There were fewer weekend visits, and he made a point of removing himself when Ellie was home. No, it wasn't that he wasn't warming to Ellie, he told Kathy. How could he not, with her head of honey curls, rosebud mouth, and plump peachy arms? It was just that he couldn't deal with her quiet, determined hostility. She would cast long sideways glances at him, sitting still with Eric on her knee, turning the teddy's face towards him as he ate or watched TV. He told her about the time when he'd gone to the loo and he'd felt strangely self-conscious sitting on the cold plastic seat. When he looked round, he'd almost jumped out of his skin, seeing Eric sitting there in the bath, his chipped black eyes fixed on him. Why would Ellie do that? He asked Kathy. What was the point? Plus, there was the name, Eric. Yes, he understood. Of course, she missed her father. But still, given what was going on, it was kind of creepy. And now it had been several days since Chris had last called. Oh, there had been text messages and the odd email, but he was always busy, always off somewhere, or coming back from somewhere else, always working late or working early or waiting for a delivery. Give it time, Kathy's therapist said, but time felt all too malleable, the past dragging the present to itself when all Kathy wanted was a forward trajectory. And so here here they were, Kathy and Ellie and Eric, always Eric with his bandaged shoulder. Kathy had offered to repair him in a fit of guilt, but Ellie had refused. After all, Kathy had attacked him. Ellie's words, not Kathy's. She couldn't trust her mother to do the right thing, and so she insisted on keeping the bandage in place. It is kind of creepy, isn't it? It felt like an affront, as if Ellie were pressing a point, and Kathy felt deep shame each time she was confronted by the damaged Eric. So much so that she eventually relented and agreed for him to have his own plate and cutlery at the table. He needs to get better, Ellie said. He's hurt. And wasn't it always Kathy's way to give in anyway? She was working on it. She had to change, but it was one step forward, two steps back. Habits are hard to break, her therapist agreed. Hadn't she done the same with Eric, the real Eric, right up until the night when he fell under a car and was dragged along the road after a late night drinking session with the boys? Kathy had seen him laid out, his chest, a deep concave where the breastbone had been crushed, piercing his heart. What heart? She wanted to shout at the hospital staff, standing to the side with their hands in their pockets. Ellie was kneeling on her bed, her stuffed toys lined up in a row in front of her, her back to the door where Kathy leaned against the door frame. She hadn't noticed her mother tiptoeing up the stairs, but then she didn't seem to notice her mother much these days. Kathy was always creeping around her now, her movements slow and deliberate. Ellie was whispering, quiet words rustling the air, her elbows working up and down, pausing only to wag her finger at Gerald and Ollie and all the other soft toys, whatever their names were. She was busy with some sort of demonstration. There was something in front of Ellie, something all the other animals were supposed to watch. Don't, and come back, Kathy heard Ellie remonstrate. And then, but I love you, really, I love you. The words fluttered, gentle as butterfly wings, followed by the burst plops of Ellie's lips kissing the air. Kathy felt wet on her cheeks. She wanted to wipe the tears away, but hesitated, worried that any movement on her part might break whatever magic Ellie was conjuring up on the bed. A sob welled up big and bold inside her, and Kathy clapped her hand over her mouth. Ellie's head flicked to the side. Nothing moved in her face as she registered her mother. Go away, she said. Kathy shook her head. Sweetie, you need to talk to me, whatever it is. Ellie shifted on the bed, moving her legs round, and Kathy saw she was cradling Eric in her lap. Eric is hurting, she said. You hurt him. Oh, sugar. Kathy wiped her nose with the back of her hand. It's not what you think. It wasn't like that. Ellie's little fingers stroked his bandages, the tips barely touching the material. Eric says you're mean. She turned the teddy's face sideways, and Kathy straightened up as she felt his black eyes drill into her. At this angle, his stitched snout was a lopsided grin. Teddies don't speak, sweetie. Eric does. He talks to me. Up and down the little fingers went, caressing the broken shoulder. No, Ellie. Kathy choked back another sob. He doesn't. Her daughter shrugged, turning back round to face her stuffed animals. Look at me, Ellie. The whispering started up again, small exultations brushing against each other. Ellie! Kathy's voice was hard and sharp as she drummed her fingers on the door frame. Eleanor! Her daughter's shoulders bunched tight and her whispering quickened as Ellie leaned forward, as if protecting Eric from her mother's voice. Enough now, Eleanor. Kathy strode forward and grabbed her daughter by the shoulder. She was stiff to her touch and fell backward, rigid and flat on the bed, still clutching Eric. The eyes, Kathy thought. They have the same eyes, distant and inaccessible. She had to separate them. Give him to me, Kathy said. No. Ellie pressed Eric to her chest, turning away from her mother. Kathy grabbed him by his bandaged shoulder and started to pull, but Ellie tightened her grip, and she found herself peeling off one finger at a time. It was no match, really. Her adult hands were so much bigger, so much stronger. When she pried him loose, Kathy held Eric aloft. How heavy he was all of a sudden, and hurried out of the bedroom, her fingers circling his neck. Ellie came scrambling after her, tearing at her mother's clothes, but her mother was too tall, her arms stretched up too high. As Kathy looked down, she saw Ellie's mouth twist as she clamped down on her leg. Ow! Kathy screamed, thrusting her leg sideways. Get off! Get off, you little bee. I'm not going to say the word. Wow, she must be mad calling her little girl a little bee. The honey-dipped hair, the pudgy arms, the milk teeth were all just a blur, something separate to her, morphed into some grotesque animal battling with her leg. The hallway stretched out in front, the mirror of the vanity cupboard in the bathroom at the end, reflecting overhead lights. Kathy dragged herself towards it, still clutching Eric, her daughter still clamped to her leg. She bent to push her daughter away, but Ellie's mouth caught her hand instead, and she felt the trickle of warm blood. Blood splattered on the cupboard's mirror. As she flipped the door open, her fingers grasping blindly for the sharp point of the nail scissors. Ellie's teeth were deep into her leg as she started stabbing Eric, plunging the scissors into his eyes, those beady dead eyes, and tearing at his middle. Stuffing spilled out, red-tinged fluff billowing onto the floor. Again and again, she stabbed and ripped until all that was left was a flattened, empty rag, a caricature of a teddy. When it was over, when her ears finally tuned in to her daughter's muffled sobs, Kathy let the scissors drop into the sink. The metal clattered against the sides, and she slumped against the basin, Eric hanging limp and ragged in her hand. Ellie clambered to her feet. She spat out her mother's blood and wiped her arms over her cheeks, smearing them in red. Oh, God, Kathy said, sinking to her knees. What have I done? Ellie said nothing, grabbing what remained of Eric and running back into her bedroom. Fluff floated around her as Kathy placed her hands over her face and sat motionless. She heard the fridge hum downstairs. the distant ticking of the kitchen clock. She breathed in and stretched out her leg, observing the teeth marks on her skin. Beneath the blood, between the sticky fluff, she could just make out a series of curved, symmetrical bite marks. And then, from the bedroom, again, that insistent, urging, whispering. Kathy hoisted herself up, leaning on the sink, not daring to look at her reflection in the mirror. Could shame burn itself on someone's face? She hobbled to the stairs, keeping her eyes trained on the banisters. Out of the corner of her vision, she caught a glimpse of Ellie in her room, back on the bed, elbows working furiously, and a large bandage trailing onto the carpet. Downstairs, Kathy let her hand hover over the phone. She was thinking of Chris, but he seemed very far away, just a distant memory, something she could never reach. She tried to recall his face, but could only dredge up the outline of his features, his square jaw, his brushed back hair, the gentle slope of his forehead. It was just a sketch, really. All the details were missing. And then she heard the footsteps on the floorboards above her. The familiar tread, the dreaded pause at the top of the steps, the thud, thud, thud of big feet, strong feet, coming to rest on each step. And as the footsteps came closer, she didn't even look up. She knew who it would be. The end. Now that was creepy, wasn't it? Thank you, Christine. Hi, everybody that I didn't say hi to. Wasn't that creepy? Hi, Element, Karen, Kathleen, Vicky, Davida, everybody, Donna, everybody I didn't say hi to. Let's see, I might read one more. Let's see, though. Yeah, I'm trying to get to the front of the book. Let's see which ones are here. Just a minute, guys. Right, Heart Made Wise, and nice to see you. Charlene, Davida, yeah. Let me see, there was another one in here that looked like it might be kind of creepy. If I can get to the table of contents. My Kindle doesn't want to do that at the moment. Here we go. Let's see. Yeah, that one looks kind of boring. Not boring, but I don't know. Maybe we'll read this one. This one is called Morte de la Motte. Okay, hi video reel. This is another kind of longer, scary, short story, okay? Sorry about the TV. It says the idea for La Morte de la Amante came from a debate that the writer had with his university lecturer while studying creative writing. She maintained that cliches should be avoided at all costs. Stewart argued that, in fact, they had their place. In La Morte de l'Amant, he aimed not just to embrace them, but to use these lovely quirks of language or Southernisms to form the spine of this story. So let's see. Let's see if this is creepy. It's supposed to be a creepy story, okay? So we'll check it out. Why am I waving by? Yes, we'll read this one, okay? So get nice and relaxed, get comfy. One more, and then bedtime. Les Mortes de l'Amant. L'Amant. I can't look at chat because I start laughing. Thank you for listening, Kathleen and everybody. As rare as Louisiana snow, she used to say. Texans like their little sayings, and she just kept rolling them out, one after another, on a conveyor belt of cliches, one for every occasion. Southerners think they add color to a conversation, but he reckoned they were more like stabilizers on bicycles, just there to prop up lazy communicators. Well, hell, he should have bought a lottery ticket today, he thought, tracing a swirl into the frost of the thick wooden handrail with his finger. He wasn't sure. What a snow cloud looked like exactly, but the sky had an attitude about it, like it was really pissed. Meaner than a wet panther, she would probably have said. He hugged his jacket to himself and pulled up his collar to stop the sharp morning breeze getting at his neck as he peered over the edge. The roar of the river falling onto the rocks was deafening. Louder than ... something or other, she would have said. Stop. A cold gravity-defying spray made its way back up to the bridge from the bottom and collected on his closed eyelids and cheeks. He breathed in the wet, invigorating air and considered how refreshing it was, how the heat of the South seemed to slow everything to a lazy, hazy blur, but not this morning. The sound of tires on dirt snapped him from his damp reverie. He opened his eyes and turned to see a patrol car approach up the dirt track and park behind his truck. He pushed his hands into his jacket pockets and smiled at the young officer, who was housing his nightstick in his belt as he stepped from the vehicle. Morning, the young man said. Morning to you, officer. My God, he thought, they really are looking younger all the time. This kid can't be much older than 20. The policeman was short and thin, but the starch in that dark blue uniform added stature. He wondered if his mother had ironed that crisp shirt. It was impeccable. The gold star in his chest was as bright as the toe caps on his shoes. And if he was old enough to be shaving, he'd gone right to the bone. Shiny boy, he thought. How about this weather, huh? The young man said, approaching and leaning forward a little, not disguising the fact he was trying to get a good look at the older man's face. Yeah, it's something. Cold enough to freeze the tit off of a frog. You know, I reckon it might just snow. Can you believe it? I was just thinking the same, officer. The young man stopped short of the wooden bridge, his thumbs tucked into his utility belt, and watched the older man looking out over the edge. An awkward silence settled between them. The older man was the first to break. Is there something I can help you with, officer? Actually, sir, I was kind of wondering that myself. I'm not sure I follow. I mean, I was wondering if there was something I could help you with, the young man said, his voice rich with genuine concern. I'm fine, thank you. Just enjoying the view, said the older man, nodding at the precipice in front of him. His hands were tucked snugly into his jacket pockets, the fingers of his right hand nervously tracing the lines and curves of the cold metal within. She's something, ain't she? Hell of a view. The name's Charlie, by the way. Well, it's Officer Daniels, but Charlie's fine unless my boss can hear you. She doesn't like us getting too familiar. Charlie laughed. Are you sure you're okay, mister? He said, stepping up onto the bridge to get a good look at the older man. I'm fine, really. Couldn't be. It's just that you look like you've been crying. Charlie's hands shot out defensively. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Hell, if my girlfriend puts on a sad movie, I'm like to bawl like a baby stubbed his toe. Oh, this, said the older man, wiping his cheeks. Just spray from the falls, but I appreciate your concern. It's just that this bridge we're standing on, it's sort of a popular spot for people who wanna, you know. Charlie sent a curved hand over the handrail with a whistle. Suicide spot? Yes, sir. 3 or 4 every year that we know of. I mean, you end up in there, the rocks are going to tear you into pieces. Then whatever the gators don't eat ends up washing out into Vermilion Bay. And by then, there's barely enough to tell if you started off as a man or a woman. Locals call this bridge, oh, what is it now? La Morte de la Mant. It's like Lover's Leap or something. One more drink, guys. I don't know for sure. I don't speak much French. Lover's death, the older man corrected in his head. Shiny boy, but not too bright. Anyway, Charlie continued, I saw your truck and thought I'd best check everything was okay. That's very dedicated, officer, but I'm just fine. I'll be on my way shortly. Charlie nodded absently, his thumbs still in his belt, his gaze out over the precipice. Okay, he said at last. and started back to his patrol car. The older man relaxed the grip in his pocket. Texas plates, said Charlie, not quite making it back to his vehicle. Excuse me? Your truck, it has Texas plates. You don't sound like a Southerner, if you don't mind my saying. No, sir. Wisconsin born and bred. Married a Texan. I suppose I'm Southern by association. The older man laughed this time, but Charlie didn't seem to catch the joke. His attention was focused elsewhere. Can I ask you, sir, what is that on your back seat? Huh? The older man stuttered. His hand again found the pocket. Wrapped in the tarp. What is that? A deer? Charlie squinted through the dirtied window of the truck, trying to discern the wrapped bundle. A deer? Oh, yeah. Right. Sir, are you aware hunting season's done? In Louisiana, season ends January 31st. Sir, I'll have to write you up if... I hit it with my truck, the older man cut in. I don't even own a rifle. Damn thing just ran out in front of me. Nearly rolled the truck trying to miss it. But the son of a bitch just seemed to run under the wheels. I didn't want to just leave it there in the middle of the road. Charlie's breath fogged the side window, and he cupped a hand to his eyes to block the low winter sun. Yep, they'll do that. Dumb as a bag of hammers. Dumb as a bag of hammers. The older man's molars ground like rusted gears. That might just have been her favorite. Everything and everyone was dumb as a bag of effing hammers. Or rocks. Sometimes the hammers were substituted, but every day was the same. Someone was dumb as something. Young Charlie was talking, but the older man was thinking about the time he tried to point out the irony of the continued use of this tired expression, her inability to articulate her feelings without the crutch of a cliche when she was talking about how unintelligent someone was. There you go, acting all superior again, she'd said in response. I know it's an inconvenience, but I really wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't ask. Sir, what's that now? Your truck. Can I take a look inside? The older man's hands reacted independently. One began scratching at the stubble on his chin. The other fluttered inside the jacket pocket. The moment moved as if through molasses. No answer was forthcoming. It'll only take a second, then I'll get on my way. Do you mind? Said Charlie at last. Well, that depends there, Charlie. Depends on what? Well, are you really asking me, or are you telling me? There's a reason I can't get in your truck, sir? Charlie's thumbs had returned to his belt, his weight impatiently on one hip. None in particular. I'm just a man who likes to exercise his rights, that's all. I don't care to surrender civil liberties unless I absolutely have to, son. Son? Did he really just say son? In what way was that helpful? The older man thought. His hand shook inside his pocket. He drew a hidden thumb across a hidden handle. His heart began beating in his neck, and he was sure that shiny boy could see it. Control to Patrol 2, the radio on Charlie's shoulder crackled. Charlie reached to his shoulder to answer, but his eyes were fixed on him. Go ahead for Charlie. Charlie, How far are you from Bob Acres? We got a situation. 10 minutes, maybe. What's going on? The Lama, the Lama brothers? I don't know how to pronounce it. Damn it, he said to the sky before speaking back into the radio. What is it this time? We got calls coming in. Seems they've been up all night drinking, and now they're on the front lawn trying to kill each other. I got units en route, but can you start heading? Sure, Sheila, I'm on it. Charlie swatted the air with a left hook and fished his car keys from his belt. I swear those boys are going to be the death of me. You sure you're okay? The older man nodded and watched as the patrol car spun and sped off, the emergency lights creating blue halos in the morning mist. He drew his hands from his pockets and placed them gently on the frozen handrail of the bridge. They were shaking. They were shaking, he noticed, shaking like a hound dog trying to shite out a peach pit. The end. That one's kind of dumb. I guess that'll be it now. Okay, well, maybe we will read this last one, or we read one more. Just lay back and listen, fall asleep. Oh, man. I love all your emojis. Trying not to laugh. I'm going to read another one if anybody wants to listen. This one's called The Bear Trap. The Jenny was almost out again. That's the generator. It started to splutter and strain, which was generally never the best of signs. The bright avocado paint that had formerly clung to its chassis had shed like snakeskin, presumably shaken off by the furious seizures it underwent any time it was being used. Now the machine simply looked like a dull hunk of metal. Calvin regarded it with his brow all crinkled up, making his 12-year-old face comical with concern. Dang it, he muttered. Dang it to heck and back. The generator stood in the middle of the big red barn next to their farmhouse. Theirs had become a relative term recently. It'd been over a year since Pops had left the farm to go get Uncle Jake, tearing off along the untended strip of dirt that connected their house to the freeway in his sand-worn Volkswagen, mumbling something about Ruskies as he left. Tears had been spilling down his cheek, but he'd not gone to Calvin for any comfort before slamming the screen door. Just hours after he departed, the soot began to fall from the sky, thick and terrifying. The ash had hammered down so furiously that when Calvin summoned the courage to peer outside, looking out on the front yard had been like staring through static on a TV that lost reception. Calvin had been plenty relieved when the ash had ceased raining down 6 weeks later. Not good. Ash. Ash. What's it sound like? Ash. 6 weeks later, it ended. Seeing the world outside like that had put a fright in him so bad, he'd pretty much stayed in the basement the whole time, eating beans straight out of the can, with a loaded BB gun set across his lap. Poor kid, he's only 12 years old. Finally, it had stopped. The ash storm had left the ground thick with black dandruff, which shifted and swirled in tight little curls when the wind kicked up. It had been dark ever since. Clouds so obstinately impenetrable, not a lick of sunshine shone through. It'd been hard for Calvin to get used to every day looking like midnight in winter, but he was an adaptable young fellow and made sure he carried a torch with him most of the time. It had a hand crank on it, so it didn't need any batteries, just a little gumption. He had a radio that worked the same way, but hadn't gotten a single clear station on it since everything went to heck. Every so often, a preacher's voice would burst through the static, squawking about revelations and raptures. Calvin had an idea that the preacher wasn't part of no legitimate radio show. He thought this because occasionally the self-proclaimed minister would start snickering darkly during his sermons, like maybe someone had whispered a particularly wicked joke in his ear. Calvin had not liked that, and the radio got switched on less and less as time went on because of it. He thought a lot on where Pops and Uncle Jake might be. Pops was not what he'd heard one of his school teachers refer to as a positive parental figure. Miss Bailey, under whom he'd taken second period English, had claimed this, and Pops had made some fairly enthusiastic suppositions about her parentage by way of response. Nevertheless, there was no getting around it. Pops liked to tie one on. Get another drink. He'd often been known to disappear for days on end before moping in like a sore grizzly, ruffling Calvin's hair with hands that stink of cigar smoke and scotch. Gas, he said, stalking off to the corner of the barn where it was kept. He supposed he couldn't stay mad at Pops, even though Calvin was sure wherever he was off having fun without him. Uncle Jake was probably talking his ear off, or they were playing Monopoly. Pop said when him and Jake were playing a game of Monopoly, why, most occasions they just up and forget the time. It did seem to run away from them so. Alley-oop, Calvin grunted, heaving the gas canister from its place next to many others on the shelving unit Pops had set up. Pops called himself a prepper. Far as Calvin knew, that meant someone that liked to keep stuff handy just in case. Well, just in case had come around in spades. Tiglet, open all hatches. Tiglet, Calvin's third favorite bear, sat atop a dented bucket in the corner. He did not open the hatch, just sat there, staring at the Jenny like all the work in the world was going to do itself. One of Tiglet's eyes had started to come loose, and Calvin knew he'd have to get handy with the needle and thread if he wanted Tiglet to keep his eyesight 20/20. Man, you sure are lazy, Tiglet. If Fazzo were out here, why, you know he'd pitch in. That bear's got a good work ethic. It's okay, though. You all just sit there, relax, and make old Calvin do all the work. Tiglet didn't seem to mind this course of action one bit and stubbornly continued sitting on his bucket. Calvin unscrewed the jenny cap his own self, and he knew he'd have to. There wasn't a bear on this whole farm, he thought, that knew how to do an honest day's labor. He finished topping off the jenny and lugged the significantly less weighty can back to the racks. It took only 4 tugs on the ripcord to get the generator chugging along, making that nice steady noise Calvin liked, the one that meant he could turn the lights on and cook his meals up good and hot. Job done, Calvin said, gathering up Tiglet. He exited the barn and latched its big red door behind him. Calvin ambled over to the farmhouse, swinging the bear merrily by one arm. He could see Fazzo sitting on the porch, probably waiting for him to make breakfast. Well, that bear could have cereal as far as he was concerned. Eggs were for workers, powdered or not. Stay right where you're at, boy, a voice spoke behind him. Calvin spun on the spot, almost dropping Tiglet into the ash and filth that coated the ground. Damn it, boy, I done said freeze. Striding over was a man dressed in rags. A bandana covered the bottom half of his face, and a John Deere cap most of the rest. His eyes peered from the gap in between, creased and as blue as penny marbles. Calvin noted that the man looked as though he'd run his whole outfit through a wood chipper before deciding on getting dressed that morning. Where are your folks at? Barked the man through the rag that covered his face. Calvin stared, his fingers tightening reflexively around Tiglet. You deaf? Don't you make me ask twice. The man drew back his raggedy coat and AR-15 peeked out. My pops is with Uncle Jake, Calvin managed as loudly as he could. They gone then, the man said, looking around the property as though he were considering putting a bid on it. They'll be back soon, too. You better scoot, mister. Pops has got a fierce temper. You wouldn't want to be around for it. Yeah, well, I guess he ain't met me yet, the traveler said indifferently. Where's your food at? I got cereal. You want some of that? Calvin gestured animatedly towards the house. The cellar within was stocked well enough, but nowhere near as overflowing with bounty as the barn, the shelves of which groaned under an amount of pickled and canned goods so extensive it could have fed a small town. Sure, you show me what you got in there, kid, the traveler said, unhooking his gun from the underside of his coat and fitting his finger inside the trigger guard. No tricks. This gun'll turn a grown buck to hamburger. Think on what it'll do to your face. I ain't no liar. We got cereal. I was about to fix Fazzo a bowl till you showed up. The traveler shooed him onto the porch with a wave of his gun barrel. Calvin scampered up the steps, grabbing Fazzo on the fly. Calvin had only seen one other person since the mess of ash had fallen. Chrissy Draper, who'd run the farm north of theirs. She'd walked past in the night while it had still been pouring soot, wailing and hollering. Calvin had gone out to ask her if she knew where Pops was, but she'd been naked and crazy. He knew better than to bother naked, crazy people. Calvin held the door open for the man to walk into his home. Hospitality, Pops used to say, was something a man should take pride in. Not that he'd been a particularly studious practitioner of the art himself. Ooh-wee, you got a nice place here, all right. Boy, this is like a damn oasis. The man did a little jig on the spot, waving his gun about in the air like some fool. If I feed you up, will you get on your way, mister? I surely don't want my pops to get back here, seeing I've been feeding half the county. The man pulled down his bandana, releasing a filthy beard that looked like it hadn't seen soap nor water since it started sprouting. Calvin thought he saw something move in there. Maybe a bug or a tick, he thought. The man bellowed a hollow, jagged laugh. You don't know how right you are, boy. Why, I bet we do make up half the population of this whole county right now. Maybe the state. The man wiped his eyes with the bandana and shoved it into his pocket. Sure, kid, I'll eat and be on my way. I'm certain that there's a place just like this with food and warmth and whatnot, just down the road a ways. I'll shack there. The man's eyes were narrow slits. They told Calvin that, like it as not, this filthy stranger had no intention of upping his sticks anytime soon. Not now. He found a place so nice to set them. Okay, I'll fix you something then, Calvin said, leading the man into the kitchen. Tiglet and Fazo were too small to sit at the kitchen table. The seats on the wooden chairs were too low. Calvin had had to construct makeshift seats by arranging old books into a kind of throne arrangement for them, one each on top of the other, one each on top of the table. Pops definitely wouldn't have approved, but there was really no other way to seat them that Calvin could think of. What's with all the bears? You got the blank gene in you? I'm not going to say that word, the man said, then spat something thick and green onto the clean hardwood of the kitchen floor. You ain't got no manners, Calvin muttered. What'd you say? Said the man. Nothing, replied Calvin, as meekly as his pride would allow. That's what I thought. Calvin opened a cupboard and rummaged around, selecting his least favorite cereal. He put it on the table and brought over a bowl, spoon, and some powdered milk he'd mixed up the day before. That'll do for a start, said the man, pouring a mountain of flakes into the bowl, haphazardly sloshing milk over it, getting most on the table. That sign out front, what'd it say? The man asked. You can't read? Calvin replied. Don't get smart. Punks that get smart get hurt, the man said, through a mouthful of bran fiber. It says, beware of the bear, Calvin muttered. The stranger sat at his table, burst into gales of laughter. Cereal sprayed from his braying mouth, splattering the table and floor. You are a funny little... I'm not going to say that word either. I can tell your daddy sure did love his sister a whole lot. Do you have to concentrate much when you walk? The man tittered like a baby being tickled. It seemed to Calvin that something might have broken up in the stranger's head. He remembered Mrs. Draper and hushed himself. No use arguing with crazy. You'd be a fool yourself to try, he thought. Calvin poured a glass of bottled water for himself and one for the stranger. His jaw clenched, and Calvin had to keep in mind to loosen it. He got the impression the stranger would notice any hostility and might react in a way Calvin might not be best pleased with. You seem pretty well stocked here, the man said, looking over the kitchen, his eyes covetous like a magpie's. I could get used to good living like this. This is mine and Pop's stuff, Calvin said, his eyes downcast. Share and share alike. That's what my pa taught me, the stranger grinned. But then the good book itself says, stolen waters are sweet. Calvin laid down a bowl in front of Fazo and another in front of Tiglet. He shook a small amount of cereal into each of their bowls. No use in overloading them. After this nasty business was done with, Calvin had decided that he, Fazo, and Tiglet would celebrate with enough eggs to choke a horse. Laziness be damned. This bear thing you got going on, about the dumbest thing I ever saw. Gimme that. The man reached across the table and snatched up Tiglet. The man lifted the bear to his face to inspect it. Looks like you're going to have to get a cane for this fella, the man added, plucking Tiglet's dangling eye from the thread over his shoulder. He's as blind as a bat. He yanked on Tiglet's remaining eye, pulling it off, tearing the worn fur underneath so that a plume of stuffing came with it. Stop, mister. That's my third favorite bear, Calvin shouted. The man laughed again. It came in harsh, hacking fits and ended with him spitting on the floor again. Where's your favorite bear, kid? This him? The man slapped Fazo, who tumbled to the floor. Calvin picked him up and brushed him off, placing him back on top of the seat he'd made. Diablo's my favorite, and he'd be mad. He's seen you do that. Well, Diablo can take a sizable stroll off a short pier, son. Now where your daddy keep his good whiskey? I know you got some around here somewheres. Out back. You want me to show you? Calvin asked. Why not? Why not? I could use a jar to help me settle into my new abode. Calvin picked up Tiglet's glassy eye and placed it next to the bear on the table. He could fix that later. What the stranger had coming to him wouldn't be fixed with no amount of needle and thread. The man got up off the chair and walked over to the door that led out the back. Calvin opened it as manners dictated, let the man out ahead of him. It was the middle of morning, but as far as the sky was concerned, it was night. Had been for quite a while now. There were no stars to see by, no moon to shine down either. Well, maybe they were up there somewhere, but Calvin hadn't had acquaintance with them since Pop had gone. I can't see 2 inches in front of my face, boy. Where's this whiskey? The man hollered. Keep going forward, mister. He keeps us still and back. You'll see it soon, Calvin answered, making sure to stay a few steps behind. They kept going forward, Calvin standing off to the left, close enough so the man didn't think he was up to mischief, far enough so that he didn't have to worry about getting any blood on himself. That was when they heard the rustling of a chain being pulled. It was a big chain, Calvin knew, not the kind you'd use to chain up a Pomeranian. No, you could use this chain to tow a truck if needed. The hell was that? Whispered the man. The tremor Calvin heard in the stranger's voice would have made Tiglet happy. Of that, Calvin was certain. You got a light? Turn that thing on. Sure thing, mister, Calvin said. The dust in the air cut the light from the torch by quite a ways, but not so much that Calvin didn't see the black bear rear up ahead of them. Pops had fed him up to near 500 pounds. Of course, he'd lost some of that over the last year. Diablo had to make do with dog feed and whatever Calvin could find in the barn that served purpose. That, the man screamed and fumbled unsuccessfully for his rifle. In truth, he'd probably had more to say, but the bear took his jaw at the hinges with one swipe of his paw. Calvin was disappointed to find he'd not kept distance enough to spare his clothing. Dang it, he said, moving back a few more feet. Diablo moved quicker than he'd any right to, being chained out in the yard for such a time. The stranger tried to scramble away on his belly, which would have been quite the feat, of all things considered, but the bear was on him. Calvin thought he heard the man's ribs snap as the bear sat astride the freshly bloodied trespasser. Diablo crooked his neck and dived forward to take a chunk from the stranger's shoulder. Geez, thought Calvin, I'd be bawling some now that were me. Of course, not having a mouth to holler out of cut any complaining by a considerable stretch. The man flopped and thrashed under the bear like an adder on a hot griddle. Blood streamed readily from the gaping red pit that used to be his face. But still, he lived. Calvin was pretty sure that continued to be the case when he turned around to walk back to the farmhouse. He always thought it best to leave Diablo in peace to eat his meals. He might not be as congenial as Fazo or Tiglet, but still that grumpy old cuss was certainly his favorite. Now, Calvin thought, where did I leave those eggs? The end. Okay, guys. You guys all sleeping. I won't wake you up. Have a good sleep. Sleep tight. Don't let the bed bugs bite. Good night, y'all. Wherever you are. Good morning. See ya. You're welcome, Karen.